The radar screen flickered with ghost signatures that made no sense. 12 aircraft, moving in formation that defied conventional tactics, had breached the northern defense perimeter at 3:47 hours. The duty officer at Elmendorf Air Force Base stared at the display, his coffee growing cold in his hand. They weren't following any known flight pattern. They weren't responding to hails. And they were heading straight for the Aleutian Corridor, with a precision that suggested intimate knowledge of American blind spots. By 400, the Situation Room was chaos incarnate. Generals barked into secure phones. Intelligence analysts scrolled through satellite feeds with trembling fingers. Someone mentioned the word provocation, but it felt inadequate. This wasn't a probe. This was a statement. The formations moved like wolves, exploiting gaps in coverage that shouldn't have existed, that couldn't have existed unless someone had been planning this for years. "Get me our best interceptor pilot," the base commander said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would echo far beyond this morning. "Get me someone who can read this situation and adapt." The operations officer hesitated. "Sir, our top 3 pilots are grounded. Henderson's got the flu, Kowalski's daughter just went into emergency surgery, and Briggs crashed his motorcycle yesterday, broken collarbone." "Then get me number 4. "That would be Captain Mackenzie Reeves, sir." The commander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Everyone in the room knew the name. Everyone had an opinion. Mackenzie "Ghost" Reeves, the single father who brought his daughter to the officers' club barbecues, who flew with a photograph taped inside his helmet, who'd been passed over for promotion twice despite a spotless record. The quiet one. The one who didn't fit the mold of what people expected when they pictured an elite fighter pilot. "She's already in the ready room, sir," the operations officer added. "Has been since the alert went out." Of course she had been. Mackenzie didn't sleep much these days anyway. Between raising 8-year-old Riley alone and maintaining her edge in the cockpit, rest had become a luxury she'd learned to live without. The other pilots joked that she was married to her aircraft. They didn't understand that the F-22 Raptor was the only place where the weight of the world couldn't follow her, where being a mother and a widow and a pilot all collapsed into a single point of pure focus. The commander nodded slowly. "Scramble Ghost, full tactical authorization, and God help us all if this goes sideways." In the ready room, Mackenzie was already suiting up, her movements practiced and economical. She'd heard the whispers as she walked past. The klaxon's wail cut through the dawn like a blade through silk. Mackenzie's fingers moved across the flight suit's clasps with the muscle memory of 1,000 repetitions, each click a punctuation mark in the syntax of preparation. Around her, the ready room buzzed with nervous energy. Junior pilots who'd never seen anything like the radar signatures now painting the threat board in angry crimson clusters. "Ghost, you're really going up alone?" Lieutenant Pack asked, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He was fresh from training, still thought of combat as something that happened to other people, in other wars, in grainy footage narrated years after the fact. Mackenzie didn't look up from securing her G-suit connections. "Alone is a state of mind, Pack. I'll have every controller from here to NORAD in my ear." "That's not what I meant." She knew exactly what he meant. The same thing everyone meant when they looked at her, the single mother playing at Warriors, the pilot who left briefings early for parent-teacher conferences, the woman who'd never truly belong in a brotherhood built on a foundation of beer and bravado. She'd stopped trying to explain herself years ago. The sky didn't care about her story. The sky only cared about what she could do. Outside, the F-22 Raptor waited on the tarmac like a predator carved from moonlight and mathematics. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, its lines seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, stealth made manifest, a ghost built to hunt ghosts. Mackenzie had logged more hours in this specific airframe than any other pilot on base. She knew its quirks, the slight lag in the left rudder pedal, the way the heads-up display flickered for precisely half a second during hard pulls above 9 Gs. The crew chief, A weathered technical sergeant named Koa, who'd been turning wrenches since before Mackenzie was born, gave her a salute that felt more like a benediction. "She's purring like a kitten, Captain. All systems green. Full combat load, 6 AMRAAMs, 2 Sidewinders, and the gun's hot." "Riley know you're going up?" he asked quietly, his voice dropping below the whine of auxiliary power units. Mackenzie's jaw tightened fractionally. "She knows what I do. She knows I always come back." It was a promise she'd made every morning since Riley's father, her husband, her co-pilot in the life they'd built, had been killed in a training accident 4 years ago. A promise that felt heavier each time she spoke it aloud, as if the words themselves were accumulating weight, becoming harder to carry. The cockpit closed around her like a second skin. Switches flipped in sequence. Systems hummed to life. The F-22's twin Pratt and Whitney engines began their distinctive whistle scream crescendo that meant power, meant possibility, meant that for the next however many hours she wouldn't be a mother or a widow or a woman breaking barriers. She'd simply be a pilot. Tower cleared her for immediate departure. No taxi, no run-up checks, just raw authorization to light the fires and go. Mackenzie advanced the throttles smoothly, feeling 30,000 pounds of thrust push her back into the seat as the runway lights blurred into a continuous stream. Rotation came at precisely the calculated speed, and then the ground fell away, replaced by the infinite vertical of the Alaskan dawn. "Ghost is airborne," she transmitted, her voice steady, professional, betraying nothing of the adrenaline spike that always accompanied this moment. The transition from earthbound to unleashed. "Copy, Ghost. Vector 035, climb and maintain flight level 400. You have 12 bogies at 80 miles, bearing 352. They're in a stacked formation we've never seen before. Intelligence is uncertain." Uncertain. That was military speak for terrified. Mackenzie leveled off at 40,000 feet, the Raptor slicing through air so thin it was almost vacuum. Below, Alaska stretched out in shades of blue, black, and silver, a landscape so vast it made human concerns feel appropriately insignificant. The radar picture filled her displays. Not 12 aircraft, 12 groups of aircraft. 48 total contacts, flying in tetrahedral formations that suggested coordination far beyond anything a conventional strike package would attempt. They were probing, testing, searching for the seams in America's northern defense architecture. "Ghost, AWACS has the picture. We're seeing transponder codes that match aircraft types from 3 different nations. This might be a joint exercise gone wrong." "Or a joint exercise gone exactly right," Mackenzie murmured, not keying the mic. This wasn't confusion. This was precision masquerading as chaos. Someone wanted the defenders to hesitate, to question, to wonder whether opening fire would start a war or prevent one. Her radar warning receiver stayed blessedly silent. They hadn't detected her yet. The F-22's stealth characteristics meant she could see them long before they knew she existed. A ghost indeed, watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to reveal herself. "Ghost, Command wants to know your assessment." Mackenzie studied the formation, her mind working through tactical calculations at the intersection of geometry and violence. They were spread too wide for a single fighter to engage effectively. They were moving too fast for traditional intercept protocols. And they were absolutely, certainly testing to see what would rise to meet them. "Tell Command they're looking for us to blink," she transmitted. "They want to know who responds, how quickly, and with what assets. This is reconnaissance by provocation." A pause, then, "Copy. Your orders are to observe and report. Do not engage unless fired upon." Observe and report. The words every fighter pilot hated, the chains that bound talons meant for striking. The lead formation was 60 miles out now, their radar signatures crystallizing into specific aircraft types. Sukhoi Su-35s, flanked by what looked like J-20s, with older MiG-31s holding the high perimeter. A mixture of Russian and Chinese hardware, flying together with a coordination that should have taken months to perfect. This wasn't improvised. This was rehearsed. Mackenzie adjusted her position, using the F-22's superior altitude and stealth to maintain what fighter pilots called the advantage. She could see everything, and they could see nothing. But advantages were temporal, fleeting things in modern air combat. Any second, one of those aircraft could go active with their targeting radars, could burn through her stealth with enough raw power, could transform this chess game into something far more kinetic. Ghost, be advised, were detecting encrypted burst transmissions between the bogies. They're coordinating on a frequency we've never heard them use. Mackenzie's gloved fingers hovered over her electronic warfare panel. She could jam them, turn their communications into static and confusion, but that would announce her presence as surely as lighting a flare. Better to listen, to learn, to understand the language being spoken in the electromagnetic spectrum. Riley's face flashed through her mind, not the photograph in her helmet, but the living memory of this morning, her daughter still asleep when Mackenzie had kissed her forehead, had whispered the same words she always whispered. Sky above, ground below, I'll always find my way home to you. It was a ritual, a talisman against the possibility that some morning she wouldn't come back. That Riley would wake up to find herself an orphan, raised by grandparents who loved her but couldn't fill the void that would open up. Ghost, the formation is adjusting, they're tightening up. Mackenzie saw it on her displays. The loose, probing spread was contracting into something more aggressive, more purposeful. They'd learned what they came to learn, or they'd decided to push harder. Either way, the temperature was rising. Copy, I'm maintaining position. She armed her weapons systems, not because she expected to fire, but because being prepared meant being half a second ahead when everything went wrong. And in her experience, everything always went wrong eventually. The Su-35s were beautiful aircraft, she had to admit, thrust-vectoring engines that could make them dance in ways that defied physics, massive radars that could burn through clouds and rain and electronic warfare screens. Their pilots were good too, some of the best in the world. On any other day, she might have admired the artistry of their formation flying. Today, they were the threat. 50 miles. The distance collapsed with the arithmetic of opposing velocities. Soon they'd be close enough for visual identification if the sun angle was right, though at these altitudes and speeds, visual was more theoretical than practical. Modern air combat happened in the synthetic world of radar returns and infrared signatures, a battle space measured in electromagnetic wavelengths rather than physical sight. Ghost Hire is directing an additional CAP to your position, ETA 12 minutes. Combat Air Patrol reinforcements, which meant command was getting nervous, was hedging their bets against the possibility that one pilot, one aircraft, wouldn't be enough. Mackenzie felt the familiar burn of underestimation, the assumption that she'd need backup, that she couldn't handle whatever was coming. Except this time, they were probably right. 48 aircraft versus one was math that even ego couldn't overcome. Roger, advise the CAP I'll maintain Northern Station. She was already thinking through the geometry, how to position herself and the incoming friendlies to create overlapping coverage without bunching up into a target-rich environment. The lead Su-35 broke formation. Not aggressively, just a gentle peel-off that took it north while the others continued east. A section lead checking the flanks, or a pilot who'd spotted something. Mackenzie designated him Contact Alpha and watched his flight path curve through 3 dimensions. Then her radar warning receiver chirped. Single ping, searching radar, not locked but definitely looking. The Su-35 pilot had gone active, was painting the sky with electromagnetic energy, was trying to force anything hidden to reveal itself through electronic countermeasures. She stayed quiet, stayed dark, let the radar waves wash over her aircraft's carefully sculpted surfaces and scatter into uselessness. The F-22 was designed for this, to be a hole in the sky, a nothing, a mathematical impossibility that sensors couldn't quite resolve. The chirp faded. Contact Alpha continued his turn, apparently satisfied. "They're testing our stealth capabilities," Mackenzie transmitted. "Random active radar pulses to see if they get any returns. They know something's up here." "How do they know?" "Because we're not screaming at them to leave. Because we haven't sent up a full squadron. Because they're professionals and they can read silence as well as I can." She paused. "They know at least one of us is up here. They just don't know where." Thunder in the distance. No, not thunder. Sonic booms. The reinforcing CAP was pushing hard, probably lit their afterburners the moment they got airborne. She checked her fuel state. Enough for another 90 minutes of patrol, maybe 2 hours if she nursed it. The dawn was spreading now, painting the eastern sky in shades of copper and rose. At 40,000 feet, Mackenzie could see the curvature of the Earth, the way the atmosphere clung to the planet like a fragile skin. It was beautiful up here. It always was. The world below, with all its complications and compromises, couldn't touch her in this place. Contact Alpha completed his turn and rejoined the main formation. They were at 40 miles now, close enough that if she went active with her own radar, she could probably identify individual pilots by their flying styles. But active meant visible, meant throwing away her greatest advantage. Ghost, NORAD is analyzing the formation structure. They think it might be based on the Soviet-era hammer and anvil doctrine, but modified for stealth aircraft. Hammer and anvil, the classic pincer movement, updated for the 21st century. One group would present as the obvious threat, drawing defenders into engagement, while the second group would sweep around for an attack from an unexpected angle. It required discipline, coordination, and pilots who trusted each other absolutely. "If that's their play, we haven't seen the anvil yet," Mackenzie said. "The aircraft we're tracking are the hammer. There's another group out there somewhere." "Ghost, we don't have any other contacts." "Which is exactly why I'm right. Check your guard frequencies. Check for aircraft flying nap of the Earth under the radar horizon. They're out there." She could feel it the way a sailor feels an incoming storm, a change in pressure, a shift in the atmosphere's mood. The aircraft she was tracking were too obvious, too loud, too willing to be seen. They were the distraction. Her mind went to Riley again, unbidden. The parent-teacher conference last week where Mrs. Rodriguez had expressed concern about Riley's artwork, all those pictures of planes and clouds and empty chairs at dinner tables. "She's processing grief," the teacher had said gently, as if Mackenzie didn't know, as if she wasn't processing the same grief every single day while trying to be strong enough for both of them. "Mom's a hero," Riley had told her class apparently. "She flies faster than sound and keeps the bad guys away." If only it were that simple. If only heroism was just speed and altitude and the willingness to climb into a cockpit. But real heroism was coming home, was being present, was somehow balancing the demands of national defense with the needs of an 8-year-old who'd already lost one parent. "Ghost, the CAP is 2 minutes out. Call sign Eagle Flight, 2 ship of F-15s. F-15s. Good aircraft, good pilots probably, but not stealth. The moment they arrived, they'd light up every radar screen within 100 miles. Eagle Flight checked in with the professionalism of seasoned aviators, their radio calls crisp and efficient. Mackenzie recognized one of the voices, Captain Marcus Webb, call sign Sledgehammer, a pilot who'd been flying F-15s since before she'd earned her wings. He'd never been overtly dismissive to her face, but she'd heard the locker room talk, the speculation about whether she really had what it took or whether she was coasting on diversity quotas. "Ghost, Eagle 1, we're showing 40-plus bogeys on our scope. What's your assessment?" "Eagle 1, Ghost. Recommend you maintain current altitude and position. They haven't shown hostile intent yet, and we don't want to escalate." A pause. She could almost hear the unspoken question. Why was a single F-22 pilot giving tactical advice to a two-ship flight of Eagles? But Webb was professional enough to keep it off the radio. Copy Ghost. We're in a holding pattern at your 6 o'clock, 15 miles. The formation of unknowns was at 35 miles now, close enough to start making decisions about engagement envelopes and weapon solutions. Mackenzie's fingers danced across her displays, updating target designations, calculating firing solutions she hoped she'd never need to use. Then everything changed. Her radar warning receiver exploded with sound, multiple targeting radars, all locking simultaneously. Not searching, not probing, but locked. The Su-35s had gone from passive to aggressive in an instant, and they were painting her with enough energy to overcome even the F-22's stealth. Ghost is spiked. Multiple targeting radars. She broke hard left, dispensing chaff and flares in a pattern designed to confuse tracking systems. The G-forces crushed her into the seat, the world tunneling down to a narrow point of focus. Ghost Eagle flight is also spiked. They're lighting up everyone. The radio frequencies erupted with crosstalk. Command wanting updates. Intelligence wanting data. Everyone wanting answers that Mackenzie didn't have because she was too busy trying not to die. But something was wrong. The locked tones were there, but no missiles. No launches, no kinetic threat, just the harsh scream of targeting radars trying to tell her she was about to be killed. It was a message without a weapon, a threat without follow-through. She understood. This was the whole point. Not to shoot anything down, but to see how they responded under pressure. To measure reaction times, to identify capabilities, to understand American air combat doctrine in a way that no amount of satellite reconnaissance could provide. All aircraft Ghost. Recommend we maintain defensive posture but do not engage. This is a provocation, not an attack. Her transmission cut through the chatter like a cold wind through an open door. For 3 heartbeats, the frequency stayed silent. Then command came back, their voice tight with the stress of decisions being made at levels far above her pay grade. Ghost command concurs. All aircraft maintain yellow weapon status. Do not fire unless fired upon. The targeting radars stayed locked. Mackenzie flew through them, maintaining her defensive weave, feeling each radar pulse like pressure against her skin. The F-22 responded to her inputs with the precision of a scalpel, each control movement translated into exactly the trajectory she intended. Eagle flight had split, Webb taking his wingman vertical while Mackenzie stayed in the middle altitude band. Basic fighter tactics: never bunch up, always maintain mutual support, create problems for anyone trying to target the flight. It was textbook, and that made her wonder what else was textbook about this situation, what patterns they were falling into that someone somewhere was taking notes on. 25 miles. Close enough now that if she went visual she might actually see them, dark specks against the dawn sky. The formation was spreading again, individual aircraft peeling off to probe different sectors. They were mapping the defense, understanding who was where and what they were carrying. Ghost, Intel wants to know if you're getting any IFF interrogations from the bogies. Identification friend or foe, the electronic handshake that kept allies from shooting each other. Negative command. Their IFF is either off or set to codes we don't recognize. Which meant they wanted to maintain ambiguity, wanted to keep American forces guessing about intentions until the last possible moment. It was sophisticated psychological warfare, playing on the fact that democracies couldn't afford to shoot first and ask questions later. The locked tones cut off simultaneously. Every targeting radar went silent at once, the sudden absence almost more shocking than their presence. Mackenzie's hand stayed on the controls, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the real attack to begin now that they'd measured the response. But nothing came. The formations simply continued their courses, flying straight and level as if nothing had happened, as if they hadn't just pushed the world to the edge of an international incident. All aircraft maintain observation. Do not follow if they depart our airspace. Commands sounded exhausted, or maybe just older than they had an hour ago. Mackenzie watched the contacts on her radar, watched them flow toward the edge of American airspace like a tide approaching a shore. They'd gotten what they came for: data, response times, aircraft types, electronic signatures. The next time they came, if they came, they'd be better prepared. The sun was fully up now, brilliant and cold. Mackenzie's fuel state was getting low enough to start thinking about bingo, the point where she'd have to turn back or risk flaming out over the Bering Sea. The bogies were at the edge of her radar range, still heading east, still in formation. Ghost, you're cleared to RTB. Eagle Flight will maintain CAP. Return to base. The most beautiful words in aviation, or the most disappointing, depending on what you'd been hopping, would happen. Mackenzie acknowledged and began a lazy turn south, back toward Elmendorf, back toward debriefings and after-action reports, and all the machinery of military bureaucracy. Ghost, Eagle One, that was some good flying up there. Webb's voice carried something she hadn't heard before: respect, maybe, or at least recognition. It wasn't effusive, wasn't a medal ceremony moment, but from a pilot like Webb it meant something. Just doing the job, Eagle, same as you. Yeah, well, most pilots would have fired when they got spiked like that. Took discipline to hold. Mackenzie didn't respond. What was there to say? That discipline was what happened when you had an 8-year-old waiting at home, when starting a war because you were twitchy seemed like the worst possible outcome. That her finger had hovered over the weapon's release the entire time, that she'd been terrified in a way that had nothing to do with dying and everything to do with failing. The descent into Elmendorf was smooth, the weather clear, the runway stretched out like an invitation to safety. Landing was always a controlled fall, a negotiation between gravity and thrust, and Mackenzie greased it on with the smoothness of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The crew chief was waiting, Koa with his weathered face and knowing eyes. He gave her a thumbs up as the engine spooled down, as the cockpit canopy opened, and Alaska's cold air rushed in to replace the artificial atmosphere of flight. Everyone's talking about it, Koa said as she climbed down. You're trending on whatever the military version of social media is. Mackenzie shrugged out of her survival vest, felt the weight lift from her shoulders literally and figuratively. It wasn't that dramatic. They probed, we watched, everyone went home. Command doesn't see it that way. Apparently you made a tactical call that prevented an international incident. He paused. They want you in the situation room for the debrief, like immediately. Of course they did, because it wasn't enough to fly the mission, to make the calls, to bring everyone home safe. The situation room was packed with brass, colonels and generals and intelligence analysts with badges she couldn't quite read. Mackenzie stood at attention in her flight suit, still smelling of jet fuel and adrenaline, while they peppered her with questions about radar signatures and formation structures and electronic warfare tactics. Captain Reeves, walk us through your decision not to engage when you were spiked. The general asking the question was Carlyle, a man she'd never met but whose reputation preceded him: old school, respected, supposedly fair. His ribbons told a story of 3 wars and countless peacetime operations. Sir, the locked tones were aggressive but not accompanied by any missile launches. The pattern suggested provocation rather than genuine attack. Combined with the intelligence picture showing aircraft from multiple nations, I assessed that engagement would escalate a situation that could still be resolved diplomatically. And if you'd been wrong, if they'd been baiting you into complacency before firing. Mackenzie met his eyes. Then I would have died, sir, but taking that risk seemed preferable to potentially starting a war because I was trigger-happy. Someone in the back of the room coughed. Another officer shifted uncomfortably. General Carlyle studied her with the expression of someone trying to read a map in a foreign language. "That's a hell of a gamble to make on your own authority, Captain." "Yes, sir, but someone had to make it, and I was the one in position to do so." The silence stretched, then Carlyle nodded slowly. "Your assessment proved correct. SIGINT confirms the entire exercise was designed to measure our response protocols. If we'd engaged, their next probe would have been calibrated to exploit our tactics." He paused. "Good call, Captain. Risky, but good." The debrief continued for another 90 minutes, every second of the intercept dissected and analyzed. By the time they released her, Mackenzie's head was pounding and her stomach was reminding her that she'd been awake for 20 hours straight. The officers' club was empty at this hour, too late for breakfast, too early for lunch. She grabbed coffee from the perpetually full pot and sank into a chair by the window, looking out at the flight line. The F-22s sat in their revetments, sleek and deadly and patient. "Mind if I join you?" Captain Webb stood there with his own coffee, his flight suit creased from his own debriefing. Mackenzie gestured to the empty chair. "Hell of a morning," Webb said, settling in with the groan of someone whose spine had been compressed by too many G's over too many years. They sat in companionable silence for a while, two pilots who understood that sometimes the best conversation was no conversation at all. Outside, a crew chief walked the line, inspecting aircraft with the careful attention of someone who knew that details mattered. "I owe you an apology," Webb finally said, his voice quiet enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their table. Mackenzie looked at him, waiting. "The things I've said about you, the doubts I had about whether you belonged here." He stared into his coffee like it held answers. "I was wrong. You flew that intercept better than I would have, made the right call when I probably would have made the wrong one." "What would you have done differently?" "I would have fired," Webb admitted. "The second they spiked me, I would have considered it hostile action and engaged. Would have shot down at least one of them before their friends shot me down, and we'd be cleaning up an international disaster right now." Mackenzie considered her response carefully. "You're a good pilot, Marcus, one of the best, but you've never had to think about what happens after you pull the trigger, about who's waiting at home, about being a parent," Webb finished. "Yeah, I've heard the other guys talk, saying you're cautious because of Riley. I always thought it meant you'd freeze up when things got real. And now I think maybe having someone to come home to makes you think more clearly, not less." He took a drink of his coffee, made a face at the temperature. "My ex-wife used to say I loved flying more than I loved her. She was probably right. Never had kids because I knew I'd be a shit father, always choosing the aircraft over the family." It was the most honest thing Mackenzie had ever heard from him, a confession that probably cost him something to make. She understood the impulse to hide vulnerability behind bravado, to pretend that being a warrior meant having no attachments, no weaknesses. "Riley asked me last week if I was going to die like her dad did," Mackenzie said softly. "Asked me straight out, no euphemisms, just pure 8-year-old logic. She'd been reading about the accident rate for military pilots." "What did you tell her?" "I told her I couldn't promise I'd never die, but I could promise I'd never take stupid risks, that I'd always choose to come home if I had the choice." She paused. "Today I had the choice." Webb nodded slowly. The afternoon briefing was different from the morning's debriefing. This time, the entire wing was assembled, every pilot, every WSO, every crew chief who kept the aircraft flying. General Carlyle stood at the front of the room, his uniform immaculate, his bearing that of a man who'd made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. This morning, Captain Mackenzie Reeves prevented what could have become a shooting war. His voice carried through the room without needing amplification. She did so not through overwhelming force or aggressive action, but through discipline, tactical awareness, and judgment that prioritized mission success over personal glory. Mackenzie sat in the back row, acutely aware of every eye that turned toward her. This wasn't what she wanted: the attention, the spotlight, the transformation of a tactical decision into a narrative about heroism. She'd just done her job. The aircraft Captain Reeves intercepted were part of a coordinated intelligence-gathering operation by near-peer adversaries. Their goal was to map our response protocols, to identify weaknesses in our northern defense architecture, and to measure our willingness to engage under ambiguous circumstances. Carlyle paused. They learned that we have pilots who can think as well as fight, who can make split-second decisions in the space between provocation and war. He went on to discuss the larger strategic implications, the ongoing tensions in the Pacific, the reality that America's military superiority was no longer unquestioned. But Mackenzie's mind drifted, thinking about Riley's science project due next week, about the groceries she needed to pick up, about the mundane architecture of a life that continued beneath and beyond the drama of international incidents. After the briefing, pilots she barely knew stopped to shake her hand, to offer congratulations that felt hollow because they'd spent years doubting her capability. She accepted the gestures with grace, understanding that people could change their minds, that respect earned was more valuable than respect assumed. Lieutenant Pack approached with the hesitant swagger of someone still figuring out who they wanted to be. "Captain Reeves, I just wanted to say, what you did up there, that was. It was tactical decision-making under pressure, Lieutenant. Same thing you'll do someday when it's your turn in the hot seat. You think I'll be able to make those kinds of calls?" Mackenzie looked at him, really looked, seeing past the bravado to the fear underneath. "If you remember that the goal is mission success, not personal validation, you'll be fine. The moment you start flying for glory instead of purpose is the moment you become dangerous to everyone around you." Riley was waiting at home when Mackenzie finally made it off base. 5 hours passed when she'd hoped to be there. Her daughter sat at the kitchen table working on math homework, and the normalcy of it was so overwhelming that Mackenzie had to pause in the doorway, just breathing, just existing in this moment of perfect mundane beauty. "Mom," Riley jumped up, her homework forgotten. "Mrs. Chen said you were on TV. She said you stopped a war." Mrs. Chen was the neighbor who watched Riley when Mackenzie's shifts ran long, a retired schoolteacher with infinite patience and a grandmotherly warmth that filled some of the gaps in Riley's life. "Mrs. Chen exaggerates," Mackenzie said, pulling her daughter into a hug. "I just did my job. She said you were brave. I was careful, there's a difference." Riley pulled back, looking up at her mother with eyes that were far too old for 8 years. "Dad was brave too, that's what everyone says. He was brave and then he died." The words hung in the air between them, a truth that couldn't be softened or explained away. David had been brave, had been pushing the envelope on a training flight, had been everything a fighter pilot was supposed to be. And then the aircraft had malfunctioned, and he'd ejected too late, and Riley had lost her father and Mackenzie had lost her husband, and none of it had mattered because the mission had continued without him. "Your dad was very brave," Mackenzie said carefully. "But he also took risks that maybe he didn't need to take. He flew like he had nothing to lose." "Don't you?" "No, baby, I have you. I have everything to lose." Riley's arms tightened around her mother's waist. "Promise you'll always be careful." "I promise I'll always try to come home." It was the most honest answer she could give, the only promise that wasn't a lie. They stood there in the kitchen, holding each other, while outside the sun tracked across the Alaskan sky and the world continued its complicated rotation. Later, after Riley was asleep, Mackenzie sat on the back porch with a glass of wine she was too tired to drink. The stars were beginning to emerge, and she traced the constellations that had guided pilots long before radar and GPS. Orion the Hunter, Cassiopeia the Queen, the Big Dipper pointing toward Polaris, the constant star, the one that didn't move. Her phone buzzed. A text from Webb, Drinks tomorrow. Some of us want to hear the real story, not the official version. She typed back, can't tomorrow, Riley has soccer practice, maybe next week. The days that followed developed a strange rhythm. Mackenzie flew her normal training missions, maintained her proficiency, did the endless repetitive work of being a military pilot in peacetime. But now, other pilots asked her opinions during briefings. Intelligence officers consulted her on threat assessments. She'd been granted a kind of credibility that had always been just out of reach before, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. "You're famous," Lieutenant Pack said one afternoon in the ready room, showing her his phone. "There's a Reddit thread about you. They're calling you the ghost who stopped World War III." Mackenzie grimaced. "The internet is ridiculous." "Yeah, but in a good way this time. Usually they're arguing about whether women should be allowed in combat aircraft. Now they're just talking about how you outflew everyone." "I didn't outfly anyone. I made one decision in one moment that happened to be correct." But that wasn't how stories worked, was it? They needed heroes and villains, dramatic moments and clear resolutions. The messy reality of tactical decision-making under uncertainty didn't compress well into narrative form. General Carlyle summoned her to his office a week later. The command suite was intimidating in the way all general officer spaces were, filled with mementos from deployments, photos with presidents and celebrities, the accumulated weight of a career spent at the intersection of politics and warfare. "Captain Reeves, I'll be direct. Your name is being circulated at levels far above my head. There's talk of accelerated promotion, of bringing you to the Pentagon for a staff position, of making you the poster child for whatever the current diversity initiative is calling itself." Mackenzie felt her stomach tighten. "Sir, with respect, I don't want any of that." "I didn't think you would, which is exactly why I'm telling you about it, so you can prepare your defense." Carlyle leaned back in his chair. "The people making these decisions don't understand that what made you effective up there was exactly the thing they'll try to take away. They'll put you in a staff job, have you giving speeches at recruiting events, turn you into a symbol instead of a pilot. Can you stop them?" "Maybe, if you help me." He pulled out a file, set it on the desk between them. "I'm putting together a training program, advanced tactical decision-making under ambiguous circumstances. The modern battlefield isn't about dogfighting anymore. It's about reading situations, about understanding when to engage and when to hold fire, about operating in the gray zone between war and peace." Mackenzie opened the file. It was dense with curriculum proposals, training scenarios, evaluation metrics. "You want me to teach? I want you to build the program. You'll still fly, still maintain your proficiency. But you'll also take what you learned from that intercept and systematize it, turn it into something we can pass on to the next generation of pilots." Carlyle's expression was serious. "Most combat never happens, Captain. Most of the time, we're out there preventing wars rather than fighting them. But we don't train for that. We train for the fight, for the engagement, for the kill. We don't train for the discipline of not pulling the trigger." It made sense in a way that made Mackenzie uncomfortable. She'd never thought of herself as an instructor, as someone who had wisdom to impart. She was just a pilot trying to do her job and get home to her daughter. "I need to think about it, sir." "Of course, but think quickly. The Pentagon vultures are circling, and I can only hold them off if I have a compelling reason why you need to stay here." The drive home gave her time to process. Teaching meant fewer flight hours, more administrative work, more time spent in classrooms instead of cockpits. But it also meant stability, meant regular hours, meant being present for Riley in a way that operational flying never quite allowed. Riley was at the kitchen table again. She seemed to live there when Mackenzie wasn't home, working on the science project. A model solar system, each planet painted with obsessive detail, the orbital mechanics sketched out in Riley's careful handwriting. "How was school?" Mackenzie asked, the eternal parent question, the verbal ritual of connection. "Good, we learned about gravity. Mr. Patterson said gravity is what keeps planets in orbit and what keeps us from floating away. Riley looked up from her work. Is that what keeps you from floating away when you fly? Gravity. Partly, but mostly it's the aerodynamics, the shape of the wings creating lift, the engines providing thrust. It's all about balancing forces. Like how you balance being a pilot and being my mom. Mackenzie sat down across from her daughter, struck again by Riley's ability to cut through complexity to the essential truth. Yeah, exactly like that. Are you good at balancing? It was an impossible question to answer honestly. Most days, Mackenzie felt like she was failing at both roles, too distracted by military concerns to be fully present as a mother, too worried about Riley to give herself completely to the mission. But looking at Riley now, at this 8-year-old who'd weathered loss and uncertainty with remarkable grace, Mackenzie had to admit that maybe they were doing okay. Maybe balance wasn't about perfection, but about showing up, about trying, about making the best decision possible with the information available. I'm learning, Mackenzie said finally. Every day I'm learning how to do it better. Riley seemed satisfied with that answer, returning her attention to painting Jupiter's great red spot. Mackenzie watched her work for a moment, then made a decision. Hey, Riles, how would you feel if I took a job that meant I'd be home more often, still flying but also teaching other pilots? Riley's brush paused mid-stroke. Would you be safer? I'd be flying less, so probably yes. Then I think you should do it. Riley set down her brush, looked at her mother with absolute seriousness. I know flying is important to you. I know it's part of who you are, but I need you to be alive more than I need you to be brave. The words hit like a physical force. This was what David had never understood, what he'd been too wrapped up in his own mythology to see, that having people who needed you wasn't a weakness to overcome, but a responsibility to honor. That true courage sometimes meant choosing the less dramatic option, the path that didn't lead to glory but did lead home. Mackenzie pulled out her phone, texted General Carlisle, I'm in. When do we start? The response came back within minutes. Monday, and Captain, you're making the right choice. The weekend passed in a blur of normal life. Riley's soccer game they lost, but Riley scored her first goal. Grocery shopping, movie night with too much popcorn. Mackenzie tried to savor each moment, to be present rather than planning ahead, to understand that this was the life she was fighting to protect. Not some abstract notion of national security, but this specific collection of small moments that added up to a life. Monday morning, she reported to a classroom instead of a flight line. The space was set up for instruction, whiteboards, projection screens, tables arranged in a U-shape. 20 pilots from across the wing filed in, taking seats with the wary caution of professionals who weren't sure what they'd signed up for. Mackenzie stood at the front of the room, feeling exposed in a way she never felt in a cockpit. Welcome to advanced tactical decision-making. This course isn't about learning to fight better. It's about learning to think better. She pulled up a tactical display on the screen, the intercept from 3 weeks ago, recreated from radar data and cockpit recordings. What you're looking at is a situation where the obvious response would have been exactly the wrong response. Every instinct trained into you as a fighter pilot was screaming to engage. And yet, engaging would have been a strategic disaster. The pilots stared at the screen, at the radar contacts that had seemed so threatening in the moment. Mackenzie could see them processing, trying to understand what they were being asked to learn. Modern air combat happens in the space between clear and ambiguous. Our adversaries know they can't beat us in a straight fight, so they don't offer us a straight fight. They probe, they test, they create situations where our own doctrine becomes a liability. She paused. This course is about operating in that space, about making decisions when all your options are bad and you have to choose the least bad one. Lieutenant Pack raised his hand. How do you know which option is least bad? You don't, not with certainty, but you can develop frameworks for analysis, patterns to recognize, habits of thought that make better decisions more likely. Mackenzie advanced to the next slide. We're going to study historical cases, incidents where restraint prevented escalation, and incidents where hesitation led to disaster. We're going to run simulations where there are no right answers, only choices and consequences. And we're going to rewire the part of your brain that thinks pulling the trigger is always the answer. The course developed over weeks, then months. Mackenzie brought in intelligence analysts to explain adversary thinking, brought in diplomats to discuss the political implications of military action, brought in psychologists to talk about decision-making under stress. She created scenarios so ambiguous that even she didn't know the correct response, forcing pilots to articulate their reasoning, to defend choices that might be second-guessed for years afterward. "This is harder than flying," one pilot complained after a particularly brutal simulation. "At least in the aircraft, I know what I'm supposed to do." "That's exactly the point," Mackenzie replied. "The aircraft is the easy part. The thinking is what's hard." Word of the program spread. Other bases wanted to replicate it. The Air Force Times did a feature article. Mackenzie found herself giving presentations to senior leadership, explaining her methodology, defending her approach against officers who thought she was making pilots soft, overcautious, unwilling to fight. "We're not training them to be soft," she told one particularly skeptical colonel. "We're training them to be smart. There's a difference." Riley noticed the change. "You're home for dinner more now," she observed one evening. "I like it." "Me too, kiddo." "Do you miss flying as much, being up in the sky all the time?" Mackenzie considered the question. She did miss it, the freedom, the speed, the clarity that came with altitude. But she'd found a different kind of satisfaction in teaching, in watching pilots wrestle with complex problems and emerge with more sophisticated understanding. "I miss it," she admitted, "but this is important too, maybe more important. Because you're teaching people to think like you." "Because I'm teaching people to think, period. Not just react, not just follow doctrine, but actually think about what they're doing and why." The recognition came in unexpected forms. A Navy pilot at a joint exercise sought her out to discuss a similar incident he'd faced. An intelligence officer credited her training with preventing an escalation in the South China Sea. Slowly, quietly, without fanfare, the work was making a difference. General Carlisle called her into his office again, this time with a small blue box on his desk. "Captain Reeves, it's my pleasure to inform you that you've been selected for promotion to major. The ceremony is next month, and you're invited to bring family." Major, the rank that had seemed perpetually out of reach. The recognition that she belonged not just in the cockpit but in the larger conversation about how air power should be employed. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me. You earned it. The program you've built is changing how we think about air combat. That's a more significant contribution than shooting down enemy aircraft, even if it's less dramatic." Carlisle smiled. "Your daughter will be proud." Riley was more than proud, she was insufferable about it. "My mom's a major," she announced to anyone who would listen. "She's teaching fighter pilots how to be smart." The promotion ceremony was simple, dignified. Riley got to pin on one of the new rank insignias, her small fingers fumbling with the clasp, her face scrunched in concentration. Mackenzie's parents were there, flown in from Ohio, their faces showing the complex mix of pride and anxiety that came with having a daughter in harm's way. Afterward at the reception, Webb approached with a drink in hand. "Congratulations, Major. Well deserved." "Thanks, Marcus. I've been meaning to tell you. I'm signed up for your next course rotation. Figure it's time this old dog learned some new tricks." Mackenzie raised an eyebrow. "You sure? It's designed for young pilots who haven't calcified into their bad habits yet." Webb laughed, the sound genuine and warm. "Now I definitely have to take it. Can't have people thinking I'm calcified." He grew more serious. But honestly, after watching what you've built, I realized I've been flying the same way for 20 years. Maybe it's time to evolve. The next course rotation included Webb and a dozen other senior pilots, some with more flight hours than Mackenzie would log in her entire career. They approached the material with the skepticism of experience, challenging assumptions, pushing back against frameworks they considered academic. Mackenzie welcomed the resistance. If you think I'm wrong, prove it. Run the simulation, make your decisions. Then we'll analyze the outcomes together. By the end of the course, even the skeptics had shifted their thinking. Not completely. Pilots were constitutionally incapable of admitting they'd been entirely wrong about anything, but enough to matter. They started using different language in briefings, considering second and third order effects, asking what-if questions that went beyond tactics into strategy. You're building a school of thought, an instructor from the Air Force Academy told her during a visit. Not just a course, but an entire philosophy of air combat. That's rare. Mackenzie deflected the praise, uncomfortable with the idea that she was founding anything. She was just trying to pass on what she'd learned, to prevent other pilots from having to discover these lessons in the crucible of actual combat. But the professor was right. Other services began adapting her curriculum. NATO allies requested exchanges. The training scenarios became case studies in professional military education courses. And at the center of it all was that single intercept, that moment when restraint had proven more powerful than aggression. Years passed. Riley grew, transitioned from elementary to middle school, started asking questions about her future that Mackenzie couldn't answer with certainty. The geopolitical situation remained tense. The probing flights continued, though less frequently now, as if the adversaries had learned the same lesson American pilots were learning in Mackenzie's classroom. "Do you ever regret not pulling the trigger that day?" Riley asked one evening. She was 12 now, old enough to understand nuance, to recognize that heroes were complicated. Mackenzie thought about it carefully. "I regret the position we were put in. I regret that we live in a world where pilots have to make those decisions. But the decision itself, no, I made the right call." "How do you know?" "Because we're sitting here having this conversation. Because nobody died that day. Because sometimes the right thing and the brave thing are different, and being smart enough to know which matters more than being brave." The call came on a Tuesday. Mackenzie was in her office reviewing training materials when her secure phone rang with the specific tone that meant someone important wanted to talk. "Major Reeves, this is General Hartman at Pacific Air Forces. We have a situation developing, and your name came up as someone who might provide useful perspective." Mackenzie listened as Hartman outlined the scenario. Another intercept, another probe of American airspace, but this time with a twist. The aircraft involved were using electronic warfare tactics that suggested they'd studied the previous encounters, had developed countermeasures specifically designed to exploit American doctrine. "We need someone who can think beyond the standard playbook. Your training program has produced results, but we need the original thinker, not the people who learned from her." "Sir, I haven't flown operational missions in over 2 years. I'm an instructor now." "We're aware, but this isn't about stick skills. It's about judgment. There's a slot waiting for you on a C-17 out of Elmendorf in 6 hours if you're willing." Mackenzie looked at her calendar. Riley had a school concert tomorrow night. They'd been planning to go out for pizza afterward to celebrate the end of the semester. Breaking that promise would cost something that couldn't be recovered. But this was the job. This was what she'd signed up for, the burden that came with the expertise she'd developed. "I need to make a call first." "You have 30 minutes, then I need an answer." Riley's phone went to voicemail. She was in class, wouldn't check messages until lunch. Mackenzie tried not to see it as an omen. She left a message, keeping her voice steady. "Hey, sweetie, something came up at work. I might not make it to your concert tomorrow. I'm so sorry. I'll explain everything when I can." Then she called Mrs. Chen, arranged for emergency coverage, packed her deployment bag with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this before. General Hartman was waiting when she called back. "I'm in, sir, but I need a promise that this is temporary. I have responsibilities at home that I can't delegate indefinitely." "Understood, Major. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Get us through this situation, help us adapt our approach, then you can return to your teaching duties." The C-17 flight gave her time to think, to review intelligence briefs on her tablet, to understand what had changed since her last operational mission. The adversaries had gotten smarter, more sophisticated. The forward operating base was exactly as she remembered: controlled chaos, purposeful activity, the constant background noise of aircraft engines and radio chatter. The pilots she'd be working with were younger than she expected, most of them born after she'd earned her wings. "Major Reeves," a captain approached, his insignia identifying him as a flight lead. "I'm Captain Rodriguez. I took your advanced course 2 years ago. It's an honor to work with you." The briefing room was packed with pilots, intel officers, and command staff. Mackenzie stood at the front, feeling the weight of expectation. These people wanted answers, wanted her to solve the problem, to make the threat go away. "I'm not here to give you solutions," she began. "I'm here to help you think through the problem. What we're facing is an adversary who studied us, who's adapted to our tactics, whose betting will respond the same way we always have." She pulled up the intelligence summary. "They're using our doctrine against us. They know how we train, how we think, what we prioritize. So we need to surprise them. We need to respond in ways they haven't planned for." The discussion that followed was intense, creative, sometimes heated. Pilots proposed unconventional tactics. Intel officers highlighted risks. Mackenzie facilitated rather than directed, drawing out ideas, challenging assumptions, forcing the group to think beyond standard procedures. "What if we don't intercept?" a young lieutenant suggested hesitantly. "What if we just let them come?" "Explain," Mackenzie said. "They're expecting us to scramble fighters to meet them at the edge of our airspace. That's what we always do. But what if this time we don't? What if we track them passively, let them think we didn't see them, gather intelligence on their full capabilities?" It was risky. It went against every instinct, but it was also brilliant. "Let's war game it," Mackenzie said. "Assume we take that approach. What are the consequences, both tactical and strategic?" The session lasted 4 hours. By the end, they had a plan that was part psychology, part deception, part pure audacity. It might work. It might fail spectacularly, but it was definitely unexpected. General Hartman approved it with visible reluctance. "This is your reputation on the line, Major. If this goes wrong." "If it goes wrong, blame me. But sir, doing the same thing we've always done is guaranteed to fail. At least this way we're choosing our risk instead of having it chosen for us." The waiting was hardest part. The mission launched at dawn. Mackenzie wasn't flying. Her role was in the command center, watching the tactical displays, advising the commander as events developed. The aircraft appeared on radar exactly as intelligence had predicted, flying their now familiar formation toward American airspace. And American forces did nothing. No scramble alert. No interceptors racing to meet them. Just passive tracking, sensors recording every detail, satellites capturing high-resolution imagery. She could see the confusion in the adversary formation. They adjusted course slightly, probing different sectors, trying to trigger the expected response. Still nothing. "They're getting nervous," the intel officer observed. "Radio traffic is increasing." The adversary aircraft penetrated deeper than they ever had before, clearly expecting to be met at any moment. Mackenzie watched the tracks on the display, calculating distances, timing, points of decision. "Now," she said quietly, 4 F-22s appeared on radar simultaneously, positioned not at the border but deep in American airspace, clearly visible, clearly capable of intercept. They hadn't scrambled from alert status. They'd been airborne the entire time, orbiting in stealth mode, waiting. The adversary formation broke. Not aggressively, but with the confusion of pilots who just realized their entire understanding of the situation was wrong. They'd penetrated what they thought was undefended airspace, only to discover they'd been flying into a trap the entire time. Ghost flight, you are cleared to escort them out. Maintain defensive posture but make your presence very clear. The F-22s moved into formation around the intruders, boxing them in, making it impossible to miss the message. We saw you the whole time. We could have engaged at any moment. We chose not to. The adversary aircraft turned for home without further provocation, their electronic warfare systems notably silent. "Mission success," General Hartman said, his voice carrying relief and something that might have been respect. "That was unconventional. That was tactical psychology, sir. We let them think they were succeeding, then showed them how completely we'd outthought them. Next time, they'll have to wonder what else we're seeing that we're not reacting to." The after-action debrief lasted 2 days. Every decision was analyzed, every risk assessed, every outcome measured against alternatives. Mackenzie's approach was validated. The intelligence gathered during the extended penetration was invaluable, and the psychological impact on the adversary was significant. "You've evolved the doctrine, Major," General Hartman told her in his office. "Turned defense from reactive to proactive. The implications are significant." But Mackenzie's mind was elsewhere. She'd missed Riley's concert, had missed 3 days of normal life, had once again chosen duty over family. The guilt sat heavy, familiar, a burden she'd carried for years. The C-17 back to Alaska felt longer than the outbound flight. Mackenzie stared out the window at clouds that looked solid enough to walk on, thinking about choices and consequences, about what it meant to be good at a job that took you away from the people who needed you most. Mrs. Chen was waiting when she finally made it home, her expression sympathetic. "Riley understood. She's getting good at understanding." "That's what worries me. She shouldn't have to be good at it." Riley was in her room, supposedly doing homework but actually reading, a fantasy novel about dragons and chosen ones. She looked up when Mackenzie knocked, her expression carefully neutral. "Hey, sweetie, I'm so sorry I missed your concert." Mrs. Chen recorded it on her phone. "You can watch it if you want." "I want, but I also want to hear about it from you. How did it go?" Riley set down her book. "I messed up in the second verse. Nobody probably noticed except me, but I noticed." That's how it always is with performance. The mistakes that feel huge to us are invisible to the audience. "Is that true with flying too, with your job?" Mackenzie sat on the edge of the bed. "Sometimes, but also sometimes the mistakes are very visible and have very real consequences. That's what makes it hard." "I'm proud of you, you know." Riley's voice was quiet. "Even when you miss concerts, I'm proud that you're doing important things." "I'm proud of you too, for being so understanding, even when you shouldn't have to be." They sat together in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who have weathered storms together. Outside, the Alaskan afternoon was fading into evening, the long summer twilight that made time feel elastic, negotiable. "Mom, when I'm older, do you think I'll be a pilot like you?" Mackenzie chose her words carefully. "I think you'll be whatever you choose to be, and I'll be proud of you regardless." "But would you want me to be a pilot?" "I want you to be happy. I want you to find something that makes you feel the way I feel when I'm at 40,000 feet, completely focused, completely alive. If that's flying, wonderful. If it's something else, equally wonderful." Riley nodded, seeming satisfied with the answer. The months that followed settled into a new rhythm. Mackenzie taught her courses, flew enough to maintain proficiency, and made it to most of Riley's events. Not all duty still called at inconvenient times, but enough to feel present, to be more than a ghost herself. The tactical psychology approach she'd pioneered became doctrine. Other commands adapted it, added their own innovations, created a whole new framework for thinking about aerospace defense. Papers were written, studies conducted, careers built on the foundation she'd laid. "You've changed how we think about air combat," Colonel Webb told her during a conference. He was a colonel now, on his way to general, his career trajectory accelerated by his willingness to adapt. "That's a more lasting legacy than any number of aerial victories." "I just did what needed doing." "That's what all the important people say." Webb paused. "There's a position opening at the Pentagon. They want someone to head up the next generation of tactical development. Your name is at the top of the list." The Pentagon, the center of military power, where decisions were made that rippled across the globe. It would mean moving Riley to D.C., uprooting their life, trading the raw beauty of Alaska for the political complexity of the capital. "I need to think about it," Mackenzie said, giving the same answer she always gave when the future became too immediate. That evening, she and Riley walked along the bluffs overlooking the inlet, watching the sun set in shades of orange and gold that seemed impossible, as if the sky itself was showing off. "How do you make big decisions?" Riley asked. She was 13 now, asking questions that didn't have easy answers. "I try to figure out what matters most. Not what looks best or what other people expect, but what actually matters to me, to us, to the life I want to build." "And what matters most?" Mackenzie looked at her daughter, this young woman who was becoming more herself every day, who carried her father's eyes and her own quiet strength. "This, us, making sure you grow up knowing you're loved and supported and capable of anything you choose to attempt." "So you'll turn down the Pentagon job?" "Is that what you want me to do?" Riley considered it with the seriousness of someone who understood the weight of the question. "I want you to do what's right for you. I'm going to be okay either way. I'm resilient. That's what Mrs. Rodriguez says. It means I can handle change." "You are resilient, but you shouldn't have to be. You should get to be 13, not constantly adapting to your mother's career." "Maybe I'm resilient because of your career, not despite it." The insight hit Mackenzie like turbulence, unexpected, momentarily disorienting, impossible to ignore. Maybe Riley was right. Maybe the challenges she'd faced had built strength rather than causing damage. Maybe the balance Mackenzie had been trying to achieve was already present, just in a form she hadn't recognized. She called the Pentagon the next morning. "I appreciate the offer, but I need to decline. My work is here and my family is here, and moving doesn't serve either mission effectively." There was disappointment on the other end, but also understanding. The military was learning slowly that keeping talented people meant accommodating their lives rather than demanding they sacrifice everything for the mission. General Carlisle summoned her one more time. He was retiring soon, his office already looking half-packed, the accumulated memorabilia of a career being sorted into boxes. "I heard you turned down the Pentagon," he said without preamble. "Yes, sir." "Good, they would have wasted you on staff work and political theater." He pulled out a file, slid it across the desk. "I'm recommending you for battalion command. Not immediately, in another year or two, but I want you thinking about it, preparing for it." Battalion command. Leadership of hundreds of airmen, responsibility for mission success across multiple squadrons. It was the trajectory toward general officer rank, toward the highest levels of military authority. "Sir, I'm honored, but I'm not sure I'm the right person." "You're exactly the right person. You've proven you can think strategically, can develop doctrine, can lead not through force of personality but through force of ideas." Carlisle leaned back. "The Air Force needs people like you in command positions, People who understand that leadership is about making others better, not about personal glorification. The retirement ceremony for General Carlisle was beautiful in its simplicity. No lengthy speeches, no forced pageantry, just acknowledgement of service and transition to the next chapter. Mackenzie stood in formation, watching a career culminate, thinking about her own trajectory, about the years ahead. Riley was there too, in her dress clothes, standing straight. Afterward, she approached the general, extended her hand with the formal courtesy teenagers use when they want to be taken seriously. "Thank you for taking care of my mom," Riley said, "for giving her chances to prove herself." Carlisle smiled, shook her hand. "Your mother proved herself. I just made sure others paid attention." On the drive home, Riley was quiet, processing something. Finally, "Do you think you'll be a general someday?" "Honestly, I don't know, maybe. If the opportunities align and I'm still doing work that matters." The years continued their steady march. Mackenzie took battalion command, led with the same thoughtful intensity she brought to everything, developed a reputation for being demanding but fair. The pilots under her command learned to think tactically, to question assumptions, to understand that excellence was about consistent good judgment rather than occasional brilliance. Riley graduated high school with honors, her valedictory speech touching on resilience, on finding strength in unexpected places, on mothers who showed daughters that women could be warriors and still come home for dinner. "I'm going to the Air Force Academy," Riley announced during the college decision period. "I want to fly." Mackenzie felt pride and terror in equal measure. "You don't have to follow my path. You can be anything." "I know, but I want this. I've wanted it since I was 8 and watched you climb into that cockpit. I want to know what you feel up there." So Riley went to Colorado Springs, joined the long blue line, learned to march and study and fly. And Mackenzie worried with the specific intensity of a parent who understands exactly what their child has chosen, who knows the risks intimately. 4 years later, Riley earned her wings, commissioned as a second lieutenant, assigned to fly F-35s, the next generation of stealth fighters, more advanced than anything Mackenzie had flown. "How does it feel?" Mackenzie asked at the commissioning ceremony, pinning on her daughter's rank insignia with fingers that remembered performing the same ritual years ago. "Terrifying, exciting, right," Riley smiled. "How did you feel?" "Exactly the same, and I still feel that way every time I fly." They stood together in their service dress uniforms, mother and daughter, 2 generations of pilots connected by more than genetics, connected by a shared understanding of what it meant to choose the sky, to accept the responsibility, to come home when you could. Colonel Webb approached, his own stars glittering, brigadier general now, his trajectory complete. "I taught Riley in advanced tactics. She's got her mother's gift for thinking through complex problems, also her mother's stubborn insistence on being right." Riley laughed. "That's not stubbornness, sir. That's just being right and waiting for everyone else to figure it out." "Like mother, like daughter," Webb said, shaking his head in mock despair. The reception afterward was filled with people whose lives had intersected with Mackenzie's career, former students, current colleagues, pilots who'd adapted her tactics, commanders who'd implemented her doctrine. They told stories, shared perspectives, created a narrative that felt both too grand and somehow inadequate. "You changed things," Lieutenant Pack told her. He was a captain now, an instructor himself, passing on what he'd learned. "Made it acceptable to think before acting, to prioritize mission success over personal glory. That's your legacy." But the real legacy was standing across the room, laughing with other young pilots, wearing the uniform with the same quiet confidence Mackenzie had tried to model. Riley caught her mother's eye, raised her glass in a subtle toast, and Mackenzie understood that whatever else she'd accomplished, whatever doctrine she'd developed or missions she'd flown, this was the achievement that mattered most. Years later, too many to count easily, though the gray in her hair and the stars on her collar marked the passage. Major General Mackenzie Reeves stood in the same situation room where her career had pivoted decades before. The technology had updated, the displays were sharper, but the fundamental dynamic remained unchanged. Unidentified aircraft probing American airspace, young pilots waiting for orders, commanders weighing options between escalation and capitulation. "Ma'am, the interceptor is in position." The duty officer was young enough to be her grandson, efficient and professional. On the display, a single F-35 had positioned itself perfectly, not aggressive, not passive, but present, aware, ready. "Call sign," Mackenzie asked, though something told her she already knew. "Ghost 2, ma'am, Captain Riley Reeves." Of course. The call sign had been passed down, earned not through inheritance but through demonstrated skill. Riley had become a ghost in her own right, hunting threats in the same skis her mother had once patrolled. Mackenzie watched the display, watched her daughter execute the same tactical patience she'd learned, the same discipline that had been forged in classrooms and simulators, and late-night conversations about choices and consequences. The bogies turned away without incident, mission accomplished through presence rather than violence. Standard procedure now, but it had been revolutionary once. It had required someone to prove it could work, to risk their career on the belief that thinking was as important as fighting. "Ma'am, Ghost 2 is requesting clearance to return to base." "Granted, and pass along." Mackenzie paused, considering what to say, what could be said over official channels. "Pass along, well done." After her watch ended, Mackenzie walked out to the flight line, watched the sun set over the same Alaskan landscape that had witnessed her own beginning. The F-22s were gone now, replaced by newer aircraft, but the mission continued, the endless cycle of watchfulness and deterrence that kept the peace more reliably than any war. Her phone buzzed, a text from Riley, "Sky above, ground below, always find my way home." The words were ritual, protection, promise. They were what Mackenzie had whispered to 8-year-old Riley all those years ago, and they'd grown into something larger, a philosophy, a reminder, a commitment that transcended any single mission. Mackenzie typed back, "Proud of you, be safe, be smart, come home." The sun touched the horizon, and she thought about beginnings and endings, about the story she'd lived and the one Riley was writing now. Somewhere above, invisible in the fading light, pilots were maintaining the watch, thinking through problems, choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. And the sky, that infinite vertical that had defined her life, continued its patient rotation between day and night, between peace and preparation, between what had been and what would be. The story wasn't finished. Stories like this never were, they just passed from one generation to the next, each adding their verse to a song that had no ending, only continuation. And that, Mackenzie thought as she walked back inside, was exactly as it should be. Legacy wasn't about perfection. It was about showing others what was possible, then trusting them to build something even better. The sky remained, patient and vast, waiting for the next pilot who would learn its lessons and add their own understanding to the accumulated wisdom of everyone who'd ever chosen to fly. And in that continuity, that endless chain of choices and consequences, there was something approaching grace, the understanding that each individual mission mattered less than the larger purpose, that each pilot was temporary but the mission endured. Mackenzie had done her part. Now others would do theirs. And somehow that was enough.